The courtroom was brimming with energy, the kind that only comes when a trial of this magnitude is unfolding. The room was filled with an air of anticipation, the hum of whispers spreading like wildfire. The rich and powerful were under the microscope today, and Victor Harrison, a billionaire with a reputation for bending the rules, was at the center of it all. This wasn't just any courtroom drama. This was a battle between wealth, power, and the law. Victor Harrison was the epitome of a self-made mogul, a towering figure in the business world with a net worth in the billions. His empire spanned across industries, from tech to real estate, and his name had become synonymous with success. Lavish yachts, penthouses that touched the clouds, and private jets. These were just some of the perks he enjoyed. But behind the curtains of luxury, there was a darker side to Harrison's rise to power. Harrison had built his fortune on deception, tricking countless investors, from small business owners to middle-class families, into trusting him with their hard-earned money. His schemes were as grand as his lifestyle, convincing people to sink their life savings into ventures that ultimately crumbled. The fallout was devastating. People lost everything: homes, savings, and even their future. But Harrison, secure in his arrogance, dismissed their suffering as collateral damage in his pursuit of wealth. Now, as the trial began, the stakes were higher than ever. This was no longer just about the money. This was about whether or not one man could manipulate the system to avoid the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was packed, filled with journalists, victims, and legal experts, all eager to witness what would unfold. But it was the arrival of Judge Natalie Thompson that would set the tone for the entire trial. The door to the courtroom swung open, and a hush fell over the crowd. Entering the room with an air of quiet authority was Judge Thompson, a woman whose reputation preceded her. She was a no-nonsense judge known for her sharp mind, unwavering resolve, and a commitment to justice that left no room for negotiation. At 48 years old, she had become one of the most respected judges in the country, earning the admiration of her colleagues and the fear of those who thought they were untouchable. Her eyes scanned the room, and every person in the courtroom stood up in respect, except for one. Victor Harrison remained seated, his expression one of mild amusement, as though this trial was little more than a nuisance. He leaned back in his chair, a small smirk playing on his lips. His lawyer, seated beside him, whispered urgently, but Harrison dismissed him with a flick of his wrist. Judge Thompson's gaze lingered on him for a brief moment. Her expression remained impassive, but a flicker of something, disappointment perhaps, was evident in the way she locked eyes with him. She didn't need to say a word. The room had already noticed the defiance. "Mr. Harrison," her voice was calm but firm, "I expect you to rise when the judge enters this courtroom. You will not disrespect these proceedings." The room went silent, the tension palpable. The only sound was the soft shuffle of feet and the rustle of paper. Harrison hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing in challenge. His smirk remained, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, the briefest sign of discomfort. When he finally stood, it wasn't with the respect expected in such a serious setting. No, Harrison stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he were granting the courtroom a moment of his time. He shot a glance toward Judge Thompson, but his eyes betrayed nothing, just arrogance, as if the courtroom were merely a stage, and he the star of the show. The murmurs in the room were soft but unmistakable. People couldn't believe it. Harrison, a man used to being worshipped, had just disrespected the law, and by extension, the people who sought justice. He didn't understand the gravity of the situation. He thought the courtroom was just another place where his wealth and influence could shield him. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Thompson spoke again, her voice unwavering, "this is a courtroom, not your office. Your behavior will be treated with the respect that it deserves. Disrespecting this court will not be tolerated." The words hung in the air, a clear warning that things had just shifted. Harrison's smirk faded slightly, but the arrogant glint in his eyes remained. He had underestimated Judge Thompson. He had no idea what was about to happen next. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that Victor Harrison had made an enormous mistake in underestimating the court and its power. The prosecution's case was airtight, each witness that took the stand adding more weight to the already staggering mountain of evidence against him. The first witness was Angela Williams, a single mother who had invested her savings in one of Harrison's so-called golden opportunities. She had put her trust in him, believing the lies he had sold her about guaranteed returns. Like many others, she had fallen victim to his web of deception. But unlike the others, she would not remain silent. With trembling hands, Angela stepped up to the witness stand. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the weight of the courtroom, the thousands of eyes on her, was almost too much to bear. She paused for a moment before speaking, her voice shaky but strong. "I trusted him," she began, her eyes locked on Harrison. "I believed in his lies. He promised me security, a better future for my daughter. And now I'm left with nothing. No home, no savings. My daughter has had to drop out of college. She's working 2 jobs just to make ends meet." Harrison didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanging as he watched Angela speak. To him, she was just another pawn in the game, a part of the collateral damage he had caused in his rise to the top. But Angela's words stung. The reality of the lives he had destroyed began to take shape in the courtroom. The faces of the victims were everywhere, each one holding the weight of his crimes on their shoulders. And then came Peter Vaughn, a retired firefighter whose entire life savings had been wiped out by Harrison's fraudulent schemes. Peter's voice was steady, but the anger was palpable. "I worked my whole life," he said, his eyes flashing with fury. "I risked my life to save people. And this man took everything from me. I trusted him, and he burned my future to the ground." The room grew heavy with emotion. The victims' stories were not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real people whose lives had been destroyed. And yet, Victor Harrison sat there, unfazed. His confidence, his arrogance, had not wavered in the slightest. As the testimonies continued, the case against Harrison grew stronger. The evidence was damning. The prosecution presented email chains, bank records, and fraudulent contracts that painted a clear picture of Harrison's manipulation and deceit. He had stolen from the very people who had trusted him, promising them a future that he knew would never materialize. But Harrison remained defiant. His smirk never faltered. He had the best legal team money could buy, and he was betting everything on the hope that the system would bend in his favor, just as it always had before. The trial reached its third day, and the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom was tense, the audience on edge as the prosecution presented its most damning evidence yet. A series of emails recovered from Harrison's personal account revealed the full extent of his deceit. "Make the numbers look good," one email read. "We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line. Do whatever it takes." The words were read aloud by the prosecutor, each syllable ringing out like a death knell. Harrison's face remained impassive, but the room was electric. Angela Williams, sitting in the front row, gripped her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This man had destroyed her life, and now the world knew the truth. But Harrison, ever the actor, smiled, as though it were all just a game. When the prosecutor turned to him, her voice sharp, "Mr. Harrison, do you recognize this email?" Harrison's lawyer jumped to his defense, but Judge Thompson silenced him with a raised hand. "Mr. Harrison will answer the question," she commanded. With an almost theatrical sigh, Harrison leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. "Yes, I recognize it. But let's not pretend it means what you're implying. It's just business talk, something none of you would understand." The courtroom gasped. The audacity of the statement was astounding. Harrison seemed completely unfazed by the consequences of his actions. The judge's gavel came down hard, silencing the room. "Order in the court." Judge Thompson's voice cut through the chaos. She turned her attention back to Harrison. "Mr. Harrison, I suggest you watch your tone. This is not a boardroom where you can belittle others. This is my courtroom, and you will show respect." For a brief moment, Harrison's expression wavered. He locked eyes with Judge Thompson, but his arrogance remained. It was clear now. He didn't just think he could win this case. He thought he could control it. But that was about to change. As the trial continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense. The public had begun to turn against Victor Harrison, his arrogance and lack of remorse fueling public outrage. Despite the growing evidence and the harrowing testimonies, Harrison remained convinced that his wealth and influence would ultimately shield him from the consequences of his actions. But that confidence was starting to wear thin. Judge Thompson's patience was running out, and everyone in the room could feel it. The final witness, an investigator from the FBI, took the stand. His testimony was chilling, as he described how Harrison had manipulated every angle of his business dealings, deceiving not only his investors but also the regulators and authorities who should have caught him earlier. The FBI agent produced a set of financial documents, one after another, revealing the full extent of Harrison's fraudulent activities. Fake investments, doctored accounts, and hidden transactions painted a clear picture of Harrison's deliberate deceit. The room was silent as each document was displayed, the weight of the evidence building with each passing moment. Angela Williams, who had been sitting quietly through all of this, could hardly contain her emotions. She had trusted Harrison with her life savings, and now she could see the full scope of his lies. It wasn't just the money, it was everything that had been taken from her security, her hope, her future. Her family was still picking up the pieces, trying to rebuild their lives from the wreckage Harrison had caused. But even as the evidence mounted, Harrison remained confident. He sat in his chair, arms crossed, staring down at the table in front of him as though he were the one in control. His lawyer worked tirelessly to discredit the witnesses, twisting their words and trying to cast doubt on the integrity of the evidence. But Harrison's smirk was slowly fading, and there was an undeniable shift in the room. The air felt heavier now, charged with anticipation. Judge Thompson had heard enough. She had seen enough. Her voice when she spoke was calm but laced with a power that demanded attention. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her eyes never leaving him, "the evidence against you is indisputable. You have preyed on vulnerable people, ruined their lives for your own gain, and shown nothing but disdain for those you've wronged. You think you can control this courtroom, but the law is not yours to manipulate." Her words were a direct challenge to the arrogance that had defined Harrison's entire demeanor. For the first time in the trial, Harrison looked genuinely uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking nervously toward his lawyer, as if searching for an out. But it was too late. The judge turned her attention back to the gallery, where the victims of Harrison's scheme sat. Angela, Peter, and the others. All of them had trusted Harrison, and all of them had been betrayed in the most personal, devastating way. Their pain was evident in their faces, but so was their determination. They had fought to get to this point, and they would not be silenced. Angela stood up as Judge Thompson began to speak again, her voice rising with authority. "The time for games is over. I am sentencing you, Mr. Harrison, not just for your crimes, but for the message your actions send. Your wealth does not grant you immunity from justice." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Judge Thompson's gavel came down. There was a collective intake of breath, followed by a moment of stillness. The tension in the air was suffocating. The waiting was finally over. "Victor Harrison," Judge Thompson said, her voice firm and resolute, "I sentence you to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The scale of your crimes is vast, and the damage you've caused is irreversible." The words hung in the air, and for the first time Harrison's bravado shattered. His face went pale, the blood draining from his features as the full weight of the judge's words sank in. The room was quiet, save for the soft rustling of papers and the gas that filled the air. Harrison's lawyer shot to his feet, protesting the sentence, but the judge didn't flinch. "Your appeal will be heard, Mr. Harrison," she said coldly, "but today the law has spoken. You will answer for your crimes, and no amount of wealth or influence can change that." The courtroom erupted in a mix of shock and relief. The applause was immediate, coming from the victims who had fought tirelessly to ensure that Harrison would pay for what he had done. Angela, Peter, and the others, those whose lives had been shattered by Harrison's greed, couldn't hold back their tears. But they were no longer tears of despair. These were tears of justice, of vindication. Victor Harrison's expression was one of disbelief. He had always been untouchable in his world of wealth and power, but now he was facing something far greater than any money could buy: accountability. He opened his mouth to protest again, but before he could say another word, Judge Thompson silenced him with a look. "Mr. Harrison, I suggest you accept your fate with the dignity you have long since forfeited." The courtroom was buzzing with energy, the audience on edge as they witnessed the fall of one of the most powerful and arrogant men in the country. The silence that followed was thick with the knowledge that Harrison's life had just changed forever. "Take him away," the judge ordered, and two bailiffs moved toward Harrison. As they escorted him out, Harrison's protests grew fainter and fainter, his once commanding voice lost in the cacophony of applause. For every victim in the room, it was a victory. For every person who had lost everything to him, it was a moment of justice that no amount of wealth could erase. Outside the courtroom, the cameras flashed as reporters swarmed the scene. The story of Victor Harrison's conviction spread like wildfire. But it wasn't just his fall from grace that captured the public's attention. It was the victory of those he had wronged, the survivors who had stood up and made their voices heard. Angela Williams stood at the courthouse steps, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. A reporter approached her with a microphone, eager to get her thoughts on the verdict. "How do you feel now that Harrison has been sentenced?" the reporter asked. Angela took a deep breath before responding, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I feel like we've finally won something. It's been a long fight, and no sentence will ever bring back what we lost. But today, we have hope. We can finally start rebuilding. It's not just about the money. It's about making sure that people like him never get away with this again." Her words resonated with everyone who had been following the case. For the first time, it felt like the system had worked as it was meant to. Justice had been served, not because of Harrison's wealth, but despite it. Peter Vaughn, standing nearby, spoke to a friend about the case. "This isn't just about years in prison," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "This is about showing the world that no one is above the law. It's a message for anyone who thinks they can play with people's lives without consequence." As the press conference continued, the story of Harrison's downfall spread beyond the courthouse steps. Across the country, people were talking about the case. It had become a symbol of accountability, a rallying cry for justice in an era where the wealthy too often seemed untouchable. In her chambers, Judge Thompson sat quietly, reflecting on the events of the day. She didn't feel triumph or victory. Her role was never about that. She had simply done her job, ensuring that justice was served. And in doing so, she had sent a powerful message to those who thought they could escape accountability through wealth or influence. For Angela, Peter, and all the victims of Harrison's schemes, the road ahead would not be easy, but they knew that today marked the beginning of their new lives. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, they could breathe a little easier, knowing that justice had prevailed.